This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network. Blueberry.com is where listeners and podcasters come together. Check it out at blueberrywithnoease.com.
So the Earbud U podcast, while fun to put together, doesn't run for free. And while we're happy to be a new member of the Blueberry Network, we'd like you, our faithful listeners, to do something for us. If you're thinking about engaging with podcasting either now or in the future, and you're stuck on a hosting company, Blueberry is for you. Look, there are a lot of podcast distribution companies out there that are going to make you a lot of promises. But Blueberry offers 3 things that made it my go-to when starting the Earbud U podcast. Number 1, convenience. With the PowerPress plugin and WordPress integration, it works with around 90% of all websites out there. Number 2, optimization. Yeah, it took me a while to accept that Apple and iTunes pretty much rule the roost when it comes to podcast distribution. But after I came to that realization, Blueberry was great at making everything very, very easy. Number 3, publishing and distribution is simple. Look, I have a lot of stuff going on in my life. I design corporate trainings, I give speeches, I write blog posts, and occasionally I get to see Mrs. Earbud U and the kids. But with Blueberry, publishing my podcast was done and over in 3 easy steps. No muss, no fuss, no bother. Look, head on over to blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u, and they'll give you a month of hosting service for free on me. You can't beat that deal with a stick. That's blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u. And now, on with the show. I've interviewed book authors before on the podcast, but never any nearly as prestigious as this book author. Welcome to the show. This is Earbud U, Season 3, Special Edition. There are myths that drive us. Myths from the past that create stories that we still tell to our children. There are myths that we tell to other adults huddled together around the flickering glow of the movie screen or of the campfire, although it's probably a smartphone screen these days, and how often do people go camping? But these myths drive us to tell more stories. Then there are myths that we tell each other to drive each other to greatness. These are the myths that coaches tell, or myths to warn each other of dangers, and myths to keep the other guy over there in line. Our guest for the podcast today, David Burkus, wrote an entire book about those last myths, the ones that we tell to keep each other in line. The myths that leaders tell their followers and constituents that drive them to produce more, to be more, and to do more. Myths also trap organizations and leaders in false modes of thinking and doing, and gain repetitive power over time, becoming something else entirely in the long run. Before I get much further into this, let's have a word for one of our sponsors. Me. When you're talking about business development for the Peace Builder, things can get tricky if you can't define your value. In my new book, Marketing for Peace Builders, How to Market Your Value to a World in Conflict, I'd lay it all on the line for you. I tell you everything that I've done to grow my business, including how I found out what the value of my skills as a peace builder were to my market, and how to price them against the market. This is not an easy process. Trust me, I know, but it is worthwhile, just like making peace is. Order your copy today and get a handle on advocating for your value. Visit Amazon.com today and type in Marketing for Peace Builders. Look, the book is only $26.99, and you won't have to pay for shipping if you order it through Amazon Prime. And while you're there, leave a review and follow my author page. There's links to my blog, this podcast you're listening to right now, and the LinkedIn group for this book as well. And think about it this way. You're helping me, You're helping my kids get a future education, and you're helping your world and the world of peace building as well. And thanks. There are myths around creativity, there are myths around leadership, and there are myths around progress. All of these myths David will address today when we talk to him. But when I think of myths, I always think of the old Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Now, in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a film that was once lauded by Woody Allen as one of the greatest films in American cinematic history, the law-abiding character, played by Jimmy Stewart, Ransom Stoddard, goes out to shoot the bad man, Liberty Valance, played to perfection by Lee Marvin, in a duel that can only occur when law and order, the myth of law and order, fails in the face of evil. Except Ransom, played by Jimmy Stewart, can't shoot worth a damn, and he doesn't take out Liberty. And at the climactic moment of truth in the film, Tom Donovan, played by John Wayne, shoots Liberty from the shadows, thus ending his reign of terror over the town and ensuring the rise of civilization and law and order. Well, it's a great film, but what's the point of bringing it up when we talk about the myths of creativity? Well, the titular line at the end of the movie, from the mouth of a newspaper editor, has come down in American cultural history, has almost become a myth in and of itself. He says, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." How many legends around creativity have occurred in your organization, be it a church, a workplace, a nonprofit, a school, that have become truth long after the facts of creativity, the facts of how you got to where you were, the facts of innovation have been misremembered? What shifts a creativity story down the line to creative legend all the way to creative myth is the old schoolyard game of whisper down the lane. When the story of creativity, which is personal and meaningful, becomes calcified into legends which tend to be impersonal and dogmatic, no amount of creativity training or innovative training or management techniques are going to change that myth-based culture. And then, because myth has become legend, the legend gets printed over and over again. And it gradually becomes an operating myth, which becomes codified at the end when innovation and creativity really have to happen in the worst possible phrase ever stated inside of organizational development, or even, quite frankly, inside of organizations. And it's a phrase that gets said by managers and supervisors and bosses all the time. And you know what that phrase is. Well, we've always done it this way. David, who's coming up next, will unravel all of this when it comes to creativity. And he's also going to talk about his new book, a great little tome, which I would encourage you to go to Amazon.com and pick up today, called Under New Management. All right, I've said enough. That's it. Let's get into it. Welcome to Earbud U, Season 3, Special Edition. Get your knowledge on through your earbuds. Our special guest for our show today is best-selling author, thinker, and a budding public intellectual at the intersection of creativity, management, leadership, and innovation, David Burkus. Now, an associate professor of management at Oral Roberts University, David teaches courses on organizational behavior, creativity and innovation, and strategic leadership. He's the author of the 2013 book, The Myths of Creativity, The Truth About How Innovative Companies and People Generate Great Ideas, and the upcoming book, Under New Management, How Leading Organizations Are Upending Business as Usual. In 2015, David was recognized as one of the emerging thought leaders most likely to shape the future of business by Thinkers 50, the world's premier ranking of management thinkers. In addition, he is a podcaster, host of Radio Free Leader, formerly Leader Lab, and to make matters even better, or depending upon your perspective even worse, my wife has described his website, www.davidburkus.com, as quote-unquote hot. Welcome to Earbud U, David.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited and apologetic that your wife likes my website. I can definitely give you the name of the folks who built it. They did a phenomenal job. Took us a while to get it right, but I'm really happy with it.
Great. Well, it looks spectacular, and I honestly, I can't really disagree with her. So
Awesome.
I can't really disagree with that. It's good analysis. You got to acknowledge good analysis. So I gave you a broad introduction there, and there's a lot more things that you do inside of the whole David Burkus brand. But for our listeners, why don't you explain to us exactly what is it that you do?
Well, so that would require a very concise way of knowing exactly what it is I do. True story, actually. My wife and I were just having this conversation because I was off on sort of a leg of doing a couple different talks, and she didn't know what to tell people like I did, right? Because, every time she says speaker, people think Tony Robbins. Not what I do. I like to think that in everything that I do, which I have a lot of different balls in the air that I'm juggling at any given time, but in everything that I do, I'm trying to bridge the gap between research and practice. I'm trying to, what I sometimes call, facilitate the transfer of good ideas. I think there's a lot of evidence-based, there's a lot of empirical research on how we as managers and leaders should be leading organizations, whether that's towards greater innovation or whether that's just towards treating our people better. There's a lot of evidence that I think most managers and leaders aren't equipped with because they don't speak academic. And so I'm the recovering academic that is trying to translate all of that into practical and applicable information.
Awesome. A recovering academic. That's interesting.
Yeah, I've been playing around with that title recently. Unfortunately, the .com was taken, but I'm going to try and coin it the recovering academic.
I think you could probably trademark that. That might be a good trademark there. But, okay, well, as a recovering academic, you talked about, what I think of, maybe you talked about, but what I think of is that disconnect between how managers and leaders should act and then what is actually rewarded. I think of the Jeffrey Pfeffer book called Leadership BS, which talks about sort of what's actually rewarded versus what we say we want or what's actually trained on with leadership training. You found a space in there talking about the role of myths. So why don't you flesh that out a little bit for us?
Yeah. So, my first book, Myths of Creativity, it came from, I had no intention of writing a creativity book. Mm-hmm. I was doing research, mostly qualitative research on leadership and trying to figure out what are the things that leaders of creative companies or creative organizations do that presumably sort of normal or uncreative organizations don't do. And I was was really trying to dig into actions. I was trying to dig into what resources do creative companies have that non-creative companies have and all this sort of stuff. And the only real sort of differences that I thought were really strong enough to talk about were the differences in stories that get told, right? And as I say often in my talks now, the stories that we tell ourselves are true even if they're not true. And that's because our humans, for however long we've been around here, tell each other stories in the form of myths, meaning when they don't fully know how to explain something, they craft a story that is their best attempt to explain the origins of something or the rationale behind something or to reaffirm a belief in something that we may or may not have all of the information. We use myths to bring what is assumed to be clarity in unclear areas and unclear spaces. And that's all well and good. That's better than just throwing our hands up in the air and going, we don't really know. The problem is when we get more information, there's always this tension that happens between the myths we've been telling ourselves forever and the truth about what's actually going on. And you see this in creation myths of years and years ago. The Greeks had some pretty crazy beliefs about how everything came into being, right? Mm-hmm. And who was arguing with what god and demigod, and I can't even follow it all. I took it all in high school and I don't even remember any of it. And then, of course, we started actually studying, physical science, earth science,
right.
Physics. All of these sort of things affected what we began to believe. So when scientific research, when real true information comes out on how something should work, we tend to run into friction with the myths. And that's really where I believe we are in the creativity space, at least as far as organizations. There are a lot of organizations, and most of them are the ones that we would call sort of non-creative, that are circulating these stories that are not actually the science of how creativity happens, not actually the sort of reproducible process that most consistently innovative or creative companies use. That really, because they're reinforcing these myths and reinforcing these stories, they're self-limiting. And by the way, even in incredibly creative companies, you find the presence of one or two myths that are actually limiting that potential just because we're clinging on to that story long after we know it's not true. We keep telling it to ourselves, and the stories that we tell ourselves again and again become true to us, even if they're not true in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that goes directly to the power of persuasion, correct? I mean, the Robert Cialdini work, where there's the layers of influence, and all those layers sort of lock together to persuade people about whatever, whether it's, I'm persuading you to buy detergent, or you're trying to persuade me to buy into your idea that there's tension between truths and myths, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so there's a little bit of that in it. There's a little bit of what we call in psychology what's called confirmation bias, which is essentially when you believe something, you filter in or filter out any information or any attempts to influence you based on what you already believe. And so it becomes harder to influence you away from that belief because you've got confirmation bias at work. It ties into a lot of different things that just make it the stories that we hear all the time or the stories that we tell ourselves all the time become true even when they're not.
Now, do organizational myths, and I work with a lot of small manufacturing and medium-sized manufacturing organizations, and one of the things that strikes me as a corporate trainer in my other life is how often when I'm talking to a client on the phone in this space, they'll inadvertently tell me the organizational myth, which of course never matches the organizational model. And then they'll do another thing where they'll frame that organizational myth as, this is the only way that we know to move forward and there is no other way. Thus, when you come in to train us in a different way, we can't accept that, even though that may have worked for somebody else that was over in our space.
Yeah.
And I sort of, not to step on you, but I sort of compare it to the sort of special flower syndrome. You're a special flower, and there's no other flower like you. But you're in a field full of poppies that all look the same.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's a myth that that our organizational problems are unique or that our personal problems are unique. In fact, I was actually I'm in a Facebook group with lots of other writers and speakers. It's sort of this secret group where we all rant about who are the good clients to work with, et cetera. And one guy posted about a week ago, and he said, this is the first time in my 20-year career of speaking this has ever happened to me. I got on a call with a client and they said, our problems are probably pretty standard, same thing other organizations struggle with. It's the first time he'd ever heard it. Every other organization believes they're unique. You said actually something really interesting too about organizational models and also the sort of you coming in and needing to convince them to shift. There's a great saying that all models are false, but some models are useful, right? There's this realization that, and maybe this is why it's so hard to turn from myths and turn to sort of an empirical-based or an evidence-based approach to different things, is that even in the evidence-based approach, we take what we can observe and what we can verify again and again through experimentation, and we build a model after it. But every model that's ever been constructed is necessarily incomplete, right? It's impossible. The map is never the territory. It's impossible that we could understand everything that's going on. So yes, you will find some falsities with this new model that's being presented to you because it can't possibly – I don't know if falsities is a word, by the way, but if it's not, I'm going to trademark that one too. I'm keeping a list as we go, actually. So you may find some trademark falsities when you look into this new model, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. If it actually hits on more, if it's more useful than the model that we're encouraging or the myth that we're encouraging you to abandon, then even in its incompleteness, it's still useful. So all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Yep. And the key is knowing when you're switching to a model that has more utility than it does falsity. I love that word. I'm going to have to write a book called Falsity. I don't know. So the key is to know when you're moving to that. And so almost every time you replace a myth with a model, it's necessarily better. The challenge I think, is really when it comes time to go from a new model that we've been using forever to the next model. Because I think people, like you said, embrace that old way of doing it. They can see the evidence before, but they tend to nitpick the one or two things that are still false. And by the way, most of the time, those things are false in the model you're using now.
Right.
You just don't want to shift.
You don't want to shift, right? Well, and I think a lot of that comes from fear. Fear is a huge driver of that. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of success. At the bottom of it, it's sort of that evolutionary fear response that we have that doesn't really serve us well now, but served us really, really well on the plains of the Serengeti when a rhinoceros was coming at us at however fast as a rhinoceros runs, and we had to run away from it. That doesn't really serve us really well now. Well, let's go into a little bit of specifics from the myths of creativity, and then we'll talk about your new book. But what are some of the myths? What are the most popular ones? What are the ones that sort of stand out for you that you've gotten a lot of feedback on?
Okay, so I don't know about most popular in terms of like everybody loves this myth. I can tell you what the ones I encounter the most are.
Okay.
And the first would be, I think so. I opened the book with two different myths, one called the Eureka myth and one called the breed myth, and they share the same root cause, and that root cause is extremely popular or extremely present, I should say. Popular, makes it sound like it's a good thing. It's extremely present, and it actually ties into exactly what you just said. So the Eureka myth is this faulty belief that ideas come from somewhere outside ourselves. I mean, we'll even say sometimes, "Oh, and it just came to me." Or we'll say, "I felt inspired," which is actually from the root Greek meaning to be breathed upon. Like you still believe that there are muses that come and give you these divine gifts of insights. And the breed myth is very similar. The breed myth is this faulty idea that there is a certain personality type, a certain genetic code, or even a gene for creativity. And we've been able to find none of that in the science. And both of them, I believe, stem from a desire to either, if we do see ourselves as extremely creative, to see some sort of elect special reason for why we are, right? So that separates us out from the muggles, the non-creative people, right?
Right.
More commonly, though, I think the people who don't exercise their creativity regularly and look to people who are consistently productively creative, we believe in either the Eureka or the breed myth or both under this desire to let ourselves off the hook. You understand, if I don't have a lot of creative ideas and it's because I don't have the creativity gene, then it's not my fault. I'm just playing the hand I was dealt, right? Or if I'm just waiting to feel inspired and it's never coming, it's not my fault. I'm just going to keep waiting until I have that idea. And again, it's not my fault. And in either case, that's not really the way it works. I love, there's a writer, I want to say it was Stephen King, who wrote about, he sort of poked fun at the idea of the ancient muses, and he goes, my muse is actually really lazy. Like he's like, I picture him as like this lazy factory worker that I've got to like blow the whistle and drag him into the factory and go, all right, time to work. And then as soon as the shift is over, he's just boom, he's back to being lazy, right? Which is a joke. I mean, essentially what he's saying is that there's another painter who always says inspiration is for amateurs, professionals just show up and work. And that's the idea, is that there's this process that you can tap into. The more you tap into it, the better that you get. And in both cases, because there is this process, you're not off the hook. It's, inspiration it comes in coveralls and looks a lot like work.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, work. Let's talk about the work. Again, this is something that I've sort of wandered close to, and I wander more and more towards it in my own writing. And in my own corporate training work, and even with other guests that I've been talking with here on the podcast. But this idea that the work is the thing. Why do we have such a struggle with connecting work to creativity?
So in the chapter on the Eureka myth, I talk a lot about this period of incubation that is essentially, it's the secret sauce of everybody's creative process, and it's what gives us that feeling, that aha moment. We've all had that feeling, right? Most people will tell you it comes in the shower. It's like the only time it's okay to talk about bathing in a context of work. Right. People will tell you that I have my best ideas in the shower, and what's really going on is there's a thing called incubation that's happening, where basically you stepped out of the work for a second. You allowed it to sort of shift from the front of your mind to the back or the middle of your mind to your subconscious. And then, truth be told, we don't know what goes on in the subconscious at that point. There's about 4 different theories. My favorite is actually the theory of selective forgetting, meaning all of the different connections and ideas that are wrong that we keep coming up with when we incubate, when we step off of it, we sort of forget all of those things. And so we come back at it with a clean slate. And don't go back off that same road. But again, that's just a theory. We don't actually know. But we do know that incubation period is important, because either you will have that aha moment in that period of incubation because something will click into place, or even if you don't have it, when you get finished taking a break and return to the task at hand, the research supports you'll have more ideas quantity-wise and better ideas quality-wise if you take a period of incubation. This is what I think is why there's that tension between creativity and work, is that in most cases you can't say like, okay, great boss, I'm going to go take a walk for an hour so that I can come back and be – I mean, there's some organizations where you can, most, even in the consistently creative companies, most are really just figured out how to structure the rhythms of their workday so that there are times where they're doing work that doesn't require high-level creative thinking and times where they're doing it is. And this is right in the research. You don't have to take a full break and take a bath or a shower or sit under an apple tree like a Newton. You just have to task switch. You just have to move to something a bit more routine, something that takes your mind off of the creative task, and you can get the benefits of incubation. And I think most people struggle with how to build incubation into the rhythms of their workday, because if they were just sitting in their cubicle staring out a window and the boss came by, that doesn't help them.
Right.
So we have this tendency to face down, nose to the grindstone, and let's push it out. And in reality, every great creative process, whether individual or team, needs a period of incubation structured into it that we have a hard time fitting into a 40-hour work week model.
Well, and I trace that back to the theories of Frederick Taylor, and this idea that not really human beings are widgets, but that production has to be a systematized, I'm going to make up a word here, scientificized.
Yeah, no, hey, I did it.
Process.
I did it with falsity. Go
yeah,
for
you
it.
just did it with falsity. So, but a systematized process where if you're not always working, I mean, I've had clients tell me this. We can't get our people to training because they have to be, that's time off the production floor, and we can't have that.
Right. No, totally. Or, the most common thing when I talk to organizations and groups about this incubation thing, and I've sold them on the idea that they need to work in some level of incubation into their workday, the most common question I get is, okay, well, how much? When we're scheduling a thing, how much time should we put on the schedule for it? Yeah. Like it can be Frederick Taylorized, systematizing, okay, now it's your 20-minute incubation break. And my response is always the same. They're like, how much time? And my response is always like, hell if I know. I don't know you. I don't know your process.
Steve Jobs used to, and of course this goes, and I very rarely bring him up because I think he's over brought up. But one of the things I read in his biography, the great book by Walter Isaacson, about him was, he would take walks with individuals who were on his team at Apple, and this was partially when he was still there, and then again more. He did this in a more intentional way when he came back in the 90s and into the 2000s. But he would take walks with folks, particularly Johnny Ive, and the walking was what sort of developed it was that incubation period you're talking about. It sort of developed his creativity and allowed him to be creative. And I thought that was very interesting. And it wasn't systematized or managed. It was just, I want to go take a walk. I'm going to go take a walk. Now, he's Steve Jobs. So if he wants to go take a walk, he goes and takes a walk, or was anyway. The average employee, you're right, just it's nose to the grindstone. I better not get caught staring out the window.
Right.
That kind of stuff.
What I tell a lot of people to do, because you're right, once you become Steve Jobs, it's easy to argue that you need that stuff. It's when the world hasn't recognized your potential to be the next Steve Jobs that you have trouble with this. Right. What I actually tell a lot of people to do, and this is what I do in my own sort of life, is this is how I use email, right? So let's be honest, most emails that you send throughout the day do not require higher levels of thinking. Right? They don't require you to think creatively. They just require you to go, yes, Wednesday at 3:30 sounds great, or please find attached document you requested, right? All of those different emails. So I've turned off notifications and turned off push so I don't ever get email unless I ask for email. Mm-hmm. And so this is what I do as I'm working, because again, I don't know how long I can, let's say I'm writing, let's say when I was writing Under New Management, I did this often. I don't know how long I need to hit my word count for the day, but when I come to a place where I'm at an impasse, I take a break, I open up my email, and I start responding to some emails. And maybe I'll get to inbox 0, rarely happens. And maybe I won't, but whenever I sort of feel like, okay, that was a good enough break, then I go back to it. And what that actually allows me to do is stay productive in the ways that we sort of measure productivity, right? Mm-hmm. You still look active to your boss, who might be checking the times that you send and receive emails or whatever. And you still feel like you've given yourself permission to incubate, yet still feel like you're doing your job, because, most of us, a good 10 hours a week of our job is spent deleting email. Right. So you're still in that mode, but you've essentially taken a mental walk, because you're not focused on that problem anymore. You're just wandering into different conversations, throwing a response out there, and then wandering into the next one until you're ready to come back to the task at hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I like that. That's a good tip with email, because a lot of folks get caught up in the sort of this idea that they have to actively be engaged with email, when in reality, you're right. Most of us either yes, no, please see the attached document, that kind of basic stuff.
You know what's funny is I've been telling people that this is my way of incubating for like 3 years now, and the first chapter of my new book is called Outlaw Email, like just ban it entirely.
Just ban
right?
it.
So if my new advice were taken to heart, it would actually negate my old advice, because you wouldn't have emails to check. But you'd have some other form of electronic communication. Email's usually not the best tool for that. Anyway.
Oh yeah. Or Facebook notifications or Twitter or whatever it is that people are on.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is a conflict resolution podcast. I'm a conflict resolution guy. I prefer conflict engagement because I don't think you can get to resolution. I think you can get to engagement. Nor do I think that that's always ideal for people or for organizations. And my work is in that engagement resolution space. And the work that I do very much focuses around getting people to engage with fights and disagreements in a healthier way, and rather than seeing those as a net negative, begin to see those as a net positive. The work that you're doing in the realm of creativity really leads into that. And so how does conflict and myth, what are some of the myths around conflict and where innovation comes from there? Because I know in some organizations it's, hey, we're going to have one skunkworks team here, we're going to have another skunkworks teams there. Just to bring up Apple again, I mean, they did that with the Apple and the Macintosh project, and we're going to have you both compete for limited resources, and whoever wins is going to have the best product. That doesn't always work, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, one of the biggest myths around conflict is the fact that that we shouldn't have it. Right. So one, there's that idea of competitiveness. And I think that can be done in a way that it works. But there was, even if you look at the Walter Isaacson bio, there were huge ramifications for the fact that Steve joined the Macintosh team, and that they basically crushed the Lisa team, which ironically was the computer named after his daughter. So that, I don't even know how many counseling sessions that triggered. But there is a sense that you can have sort of a competitive rivalry going on that pushes you to be better. Joshua Wolfshank, the essayist, has a great book called The Powers of Two that is basically about that, how competing dualities? Yeah, that's a word. Dualities can actually further you to better work, right? But then there's this other deeper level myth that the goal, I love what you said there, that you don't do conflict resolution, you do conflict engagement, because the myth is essentially that conflict is supposed to be resolved. Right. And that if you have conflict, you're doing it wrong. And that's just simply not true. The most consistently creative and innovative companies structure task-focused conflict at every step of the way, because they realize it makes a better product. And they realize that you're always, even when you ship the product, you're always going to have some battles you lost and some you won. And you're always going to walk away thinking that I should have fought harder for that, et cetera. But the end user doesn't know about any of this, and they end up just sort of delighted because the best ideas won. And I cite a bunch of different corporate examples of this in the myths of creativity, but one of my favorites is the company Evernote. You probably use Evernote. I mean, you probably have a free account on Evernote. So does everybody else. I think that's probably the problem they need conflict over right now, is how do we get people to pay for this amazing thing? But they were actually two companies. So there was Evernote, and then there was a company called Ribbon. And Phil Libin, I think is how you say his last name, was the CEO of Ribbon. And basically they were both working on super secret external memory projects that somehow they found out about each other, even though they were both super secret startups. And so rather than fight in the competitive space, they decided to merge. But they still then, under one company, still fought. And every single step of developing the product, there was a fight over what Ribbon had done and what Evernote had done, and only the best ideas won. And the CEO has even said, this is what made the product so great, is that only the best ideas won. There's really no way they could have had such a great product if they had just sort of decided, well, conflict's not the goal, so I'll just decide which things from which company we're going to keep, and then we'll all go along with it. No, they needed to step in and engage in that conflict so that the best ideas could win.
What I found... And what you're saying, absolutely. I mean, you're right. Yes, healthy competition, encouraged, controlled, healthy competition. What I find is a lot of owners, founders, presidents, and even managers. And again, those titles, I think we conflate with leadership. So I tend not to conflate those two. But those titles, that positional authority, there's human beings behind that positional authority, and those human beings are telling themselves myths about conflicts. And their responses to conflict, their responses to even difficulty or confrontation drive their teams and drive their organizations in such subtle ways that most people don't even see them. Like I've worked with many organizations that are, quite frankly, built around an owner that was a conflict avoider. And they got to a certain point in the market, and now they're stagnating and they don't know what to do. And when I say, hey, you should probably engage in some healthy conflict, immediate pullback. Like, I can't. I'm not gonna do that. That doesn't make me feel comfortable. And so then my job becomes coaching that that owner or that founder towards, where did this start? Let's chase some root causes, that kind of stuff. And really looking at that tension, like you're talking about before, between truths and myths, and what is true versus what you've been telling yourself, the stories you've been telling yourself about your organization, about your space in the market, about your added value or subtracted value, depending upon how you're looking at it, and where you can go. And those are always interesting kinds of conversations to have, at least on my end. So let's switch to Under New Management. I'm interested in the new book. Tell us about that. Where did the new book sort of come from?
Where did it come from?
What was the eureka moment, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. The book, the idea for the book was generated from writing. I mean, I think this is the case for every writer, but that's a myth I'm telling myself. Was in the midst of writing Myths of Creativity, one of the things I got sort of a front row seat on were all of the different ways of doing things that these consistently productive, consistently creative companies were doing, the models that came out of correcting these myths. And so I got to write about things like hackathons at Twitter and Facebook, and the famous sort of 20% time at Google. Although if you talk to anyone at Google, it's usually 120% time, meaning, you can do that. You just got to get all your other work done too. Mm-hmm. Started looking at companies with, apps with no hierarchy, with kind of a matrix or a network structure. And these just really sort of fascinated me. And I couldn't not be fascinated with them. Especially, I come from the lens, like I'm a recovering academic, right? And I was trained by training, I'm an organizational psychologist. And so I can't see stuff not through that lens. And so I'm seeing all these ideas that if you set it to a normal executive in a 1,000-person faceless company with a big big glass headquarters along, the highway in New Jersey or whatever, would just look like, well, that's crazy. That's not how we do things around here. Of course, what if how you do things around here isn't the way you should be doing them?
The way you
right?
should be doing things. Right?
And so I'm looking at this through the lens of organizational psychology, going, a lot of these crazy ideas line up with a lot of really good social science on how we should actually be doing things, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not the first person. Edward Deasy and Richard Ryan talked about the need for autonomy. Dan Pink, popularized it in Drive. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the ultimate way to give someone autonomy? Well, it's making the hierarchy as flat or as matrixed as possible, and sort of getting rid of as many management layers as we can, or firing managers entirely and letting people manage their own relationships between all of the other employees.
Like Tony Hsieh's kind of done over at Zappos with the holacracy and that.
Yeah. Okay, I got to pause there. I'm not a huge fan of holacracy because I think my jury is just still out on it. Like it hasn't been around long enough for me to speak to it. So I don't want to. So I don't want to endorse it because I don't. But I will tell you that there are companies that have been doing it for some 40, 50 years. W.L. Gore is probably the most famous. Mm-hmm. You also have this fascinating Morningstar Farms out of California has been doing it for forever. Semco out of Brazil has been doing it for. There are companies that have been doing some form of leaderless structure for a really long time. Holacracy might be one way to structure it. Who knows? But the broader idea of giving individual employees who are intrinsically motivated to do this work for this company as much autonomy as possible, there's a ton of science behind that, right? That's an idea you can get behind. In the same way, there are other ideas that seem even crazier, like there's a lot of companies now, Whole Foods is probably the biggest one that everybody would be familiar with, that let everybody know what everybody gets paid. Everybody knows everybody's salaries. And actually at Whole Foods, everybody knows the performance data for that store and that department that they work in. Anybody can look it up on the internet. And that totally sounds crazy. In fact, I, on an almost daily basis, talk to people who work in HR who say, well, we have a policy against that. even though that policy might actually violate the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. We have a policy against that. From the lens of psychology, there's this model called equity theory that says basically when people are always judging what they're getting paid to how much they're putting in, and they get strife when they feel like somebody is getting paid more than what they're putting in and that it's not equitable. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is in the absence of actual accurate pay information, we make stuff up, and we're terrible at it. Like every study that attempts to like estimate what your coworkers make, we're awful at it. So what do you think that does to our strife if we actually think some people are overpaid when they actually make less than what we think, but we're not allowed to talk about it, and then other people who work really hard that we see as underpaid might actually be making an equitable salary? We just don't know because we're not allowed to talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. So this is essentially what under-new management is. That the overarching concept is that we have all of these things that, in my opinion, sort of stem from that Frederick Taylor, how to run an efficient factory idea. We have all of these layers of management models that have been built on top of principles of scientific management. Well, the underlying assumption of scientific management is that work can always be routinized and systematized and made to be the most effective. Mm-hmm. And that's just not necessarily true in a knowledge economy, where we shift from a physical factory to an idea factory or a decision factory. Things get different. The underlying assumptions are different, and this is to me what these policies prove is that it's not just like, oh, let's do an open salary thing and the world will be perfect. It's we really need to rethink the bulk of what we think about management, because the assumptions that are the bedrock of this whole thing are proving to be a little shaky. So as I actually open the book with, I think it's time that management needs new management, meaning management needs some people who can start going, okay, let's go back to the foundations and let's build from there. And I think that's what these companies are doing. They're all running their own individual experiments, but collectively, if we keep track of what's going on this, I think we're going to get at a better overarching model about how to lead or how to manage in a knowledge economy.
But you've been to let me, and I agree with you, but let me push back on you.
No, go for it.
You've been to the fancy dinner dress parties where you're in one room, or maybe you haven't. Maybe you don't go to these kinds of parties. I've been to these kind of parties where, you're in one room and the only topic of conversation in that room is who's doing what in that other room. Like, is that other room better than the room that we're in right now? Or when you were in school, when I was in school, class rank, who had the most expensive car, who lived in the better neighborhood, who could get to a certain place faster. There was the company in Seattle that, raised their lowest wage tier to, what was it, $70,000? I'm sure you heard about this.
Oh yeah.
And two people, who got paid more than most of the other workers actually quit because they felt that the people who weren't as productive, were getting paid more and it wasn't fair, and that they weren't being rewarded for, you talk about equity theory, they weren't being rewarded in an equitable way, what they felt was equitable. So they were like, okay, I'm out. And they quit a good job that they liked because other people, got more money. We have an entire culture of getting ahead in this country, right? And so how can organizations, and you mentioned Whole Foods and other ones, but how do organizations build from scratch, new models that will sort of scrub out this getting ahead thing that we seem to have built into us from the time that we're in school going K through 12 all the way to when we start working?
Yeah. And I should say that I don't know that we ever will. Google famously defends that they pay very much unequally. They'll pay two people who have the same job on the org chart very different salaries depending on the level of value that they bring into the organization. And the problem, like equality and equity are not the same thing.
Right.
Equity is I give X and get paid X. John gives Y and gets paid Y. That's equity. Mm-hmm. I give X and get paid Y, and John gives Y and gets paid X. That makes me mad. And that's essentially what we saw in gravity payments. It wasn't that everybody got it wasn't that a rising tide raising all boats and everybody got a 20% raise because 20% was what it took to get the lowest paid person to $70,000 or whatever. It was these people who have been paid less, who presumably are occupying positions that don't give as much value to the broader organization than do some of these other people who are already paid above $70,000. They're going to get huge percentage raises, and you're just going to get little ones, or maybe not even at all, right? And so It is that sort of violation of equity theory. I think even the competitive drive is fine if we're in a situation of transparency. So if I know how much I get paid and how much you get paid, and I know your performance data and my performance data, or if we're on the same team, I can actually see your performance every day, then this is fine. As long as the pay system is equitable, right? That's the big secret is you can't just pull off the curtain and reveal a bunch of inequity. You have to actually make it equitable. When you study every company that made the shift from pay secrecy to pay transparency, there was a lot of salary adjustment that went on just before they pulled back the curtain and revealed it all because they realized they had to sort of account for that. The benefit is that in this system, you know exactly what you need to do to get ahead. You know what you need to do to make more money. And this is actually one of the things that John Mackey at Whole Foods always sort of talks about is when he decided to do it, and they've done it since the mid-90s, he did it mostly because people called him overpaid, and he basically went, no, here's what I make, and here's what everybody makes. And then now when you come to him or when you come to one of the other senior leaders or regional managers, whatever, and say that so-and-so gets paid this, and that's $10,000 more than me, they can basically look at performance data and go, yeah, that's because he provides $10,000 of value more than you do in a given year. And here's the 3 things you need to do to be able to do that.
Okay, but see value. Okay, not.
No, and so yes, there's a huge assumption here that our performance metrics and whatever you're using to do annual reviews, and I'm actually not a fan of annual reviews, but that's a different monologue altogether. Whatever we're doing is giving people an accurate picture of where they stand and where they stand compared to their peers performance-wise. Okay. And then also it can even be, because remember, equity is not equality, also what their job is. If you're, I hate to trash this position, and it's not my intent. It's a very valuable position. But if you're an executive assistant, that's not the same thing as being a senior level coder at a tech company, right? It's assumed that one of them provides a bit more value to the company, one of them requires a bit more training, et cetera. And grown-ups are actually capable of internalizing all that when we're transparent with them. It's when we hide it all between the veil of secrecy and say, shh, nobody talk about it because there'll be a fight. There'll be a fight because there's inequity. If there were transparency and equity, there might be a week or so of people being like, oh, I'm going to look this up on the internet. So-and-so makes that. And then in almost every corporate example, it goes back to sort of normal. And there's not a problem until somebody starts to slack off. And then, interestingly enough, that problem is self-correcting.
Right. The employees end up policing each other.
Right. Or they make a case why they should get paid more money, and they have the data to make that case.
Correct.
And if they don't have the data to make that case and they're making a faulty argument, then we can have that conversation. But that's a conversation we can't even have in a secrecy approach.
Correct. Well, and I would love to go further down this road, because there's, the ongoing argument in this country about, and you see it everywhere, the 99% versus the 1%. How do you determine what is valuable? Why do corporate CEOs get paid outsized salaries? And it's not even salaries. It's mostly benefits and stock options. But why do they get paid this much versus the janitor that much? And I think that I know from what you've been telling me about your book that this sort of leads into those more rabbit hole considerations that are probably a little bit beyond the scope of this podcast, but are definitely very interesting to me, and I know will be interesting to the listeners who will potentially be readers of the book. So you got equity theory, you've got intrinsic motivation, you were looking at hackathons and 120% time, and holacracy without calling it holacracy. What else were you looking at under new management, and what are some conclusions that you came to?
Yeah, so I should tell you one of the other fascinating things I learned is I wanted to dig into that unlimited vacation time policy at Netflix and other places that everybody talks about, and that's another huge one like salary that we could go down all these different rabbit holes over people take more vacation, they take less vacation, blah, blah, blah. One of the most interesting things I found is that in most of the companies where this happens, it's actually not about the number of vacation days. It's about trust. It's about the fact that an unlimited vacation policy says, we trust you to know how much of a break you need. We trust you to keep track of when you're working and when you're not working. When we don't ask you to write down your hours when you do work. So why are we treating you like an 8th grader on vacation days? Why don't we just trust you to act in our best interest? And the 2 or 3 people who might not, we'll invite them to be successful elsewhere. But everybody else, if you can work like an adult, we'll treat you like an adult. And it's amazing how that act of trust creates reciprocal trust. And there's a bunch of really interesting research actually from Paul Zak on trust and on reciprocal trust. that I dig into, and I think that's what unlimited vacation policies do. And that's actually why at Netflix, probably the most famous unlimited vacation policy, you see basically the next thing that happened was they switched and made their expense reporting policy act in Netflix's best interest. 5 words long, then skip to the next policy. Meaning, when you have to go on a business trip, expense what you need to expense. We trust you to act in our best interest. If you don't, we've got a problem, and we'll deal with that on a case-by-case basis. But most of you, we trust that you'll do that, and they respond in kind. And it's, to me, I think that speaks to the broader lesson, which is, yes, every one of the policies in this book sound crazy. Every one of the leadership practices in the book are incredibly counterintuitive, but they're what's right for that organization and that culture at that time. And that's really the lesson. Is that for 100 years, starting with scientific management, starting with a couple other people who were leaders in industrial management theory, we have designed a whole organization basically around the manufacture of a product. We've been product centric, right?
Yep.
And that's what Frederick Taylor did to make sure that we could get the right product efficiently. That's what the org chart does. It basically says, we have to create and sell this product, so here's the positions that we need. We're sort of done with that era. Mm-hmm. And we need to be in an era where we're actually building the organization around people. If we're really in a knowledge work economy, if our people are our greatest asset, which is a term I hate, I prefer our people are our greatest source of competitive advantage. But if the value that they bring is between their 2 ears and they take it with them at the end of the shift, right, then we need to build a model of how to lead them that focuses on them first, because they're the means of production, they're the product, it's all there. So it's not that these are sort of crazy. Yeah, they're crazy compared to Frederick Taylor's, factory work. But when we're in a decision factory, an idea factory, we need to shift from building around an organizational model from around a product to around people and the people who work in that organization.
Well, and even that thinking, because my next question was going to be, why does management have trust issues? But you answered it. I mean, you answered it right there, because management has come up in this product-centric mode rather than a people-centric mode, which the product-centric mode is just another myth. Added another chapter to your book, the previous book there.
There you go.
But, it's just another myth, right? It's just another story they've been telling themselves. And so it goes back to what you were covering in your first book as well. So I see these two books as really linking and tying in. And I'm sure you got a third book, coming in you somewhere, that's coming out. Another eureka moment that you'll have.
No, I mean, it's true that actually I think that when you, at least I found this to be true, and most of the other nonfiction writers that I talk to find this to be true, is that, you said the term rabbit trail or rabbit hole earlier. Mm-hmm. When you're writing a book, there's always stuff that pops up that you're like, that seems really interesting. I don't have the space to talk about it here. And that usually becomes the next book, just like in this case. And so there's a rabbit hole I've been staring down for a little bit right now. I'm not at the point where I want to talk about it. Sure. But yeah, it's there. And again, it's this idea that I think we've been using myths and not very empirical models to guide most of how we work through our life. And fortunately, there's 50 to 100 years of social science that can help us figure out how to be a human and act well around other humans. Right. And we need to do more of using that because it's there. My wife is a physician, so maybe this is where that rant comes from, is that, physicians are trained now in evidence-based management. We don't still bloodlet people and give them leeches or whatever, right? We run experiments, we figure out what works, and we use that to inform our practice of medicine. Well, the practice of management ought to be the same way. It ought to be evidence-based.
When I go into organizations, I talk a lot about, and it's kind of, I'm leaning into where you're going, and I'll definitely be buying your book and probably using it and facilitating it and pulling the information from it in the conflict engagement workshops that I run and the leadership workshops that I run and those kinds of skill sets workshops that I run, because I think there's some real core stuff here that could really be distilled down for folks. I got on a kick last year, and I really am still on it. I just haven't blogged about it lately. But this idea of emotional labor and the pushback that you get from management when they switch from being product centric to being people centric. And I sort of open up this conversation with management saying that, not even management, but saying with factory workers, if I go into a factory, and I use the factory as sort of the catch-all, but I say a robot could replace every single one of you in here. So the only work that matters is heart work, and you have to do emotional labor. You have to actually care about other people. care about other people at work, and communicate that caring to people at work. Management gets very nervous when I say this, but that idea of emotional labor, that idea that there's actual value in doing emotional things, is pushed back on because the pushback is it's not quantifiable. Did you find that in your research, or is it quantifiable? Can we quantify the value of that to an organization?
Short answer, no.
Okay.
Long answer, yes, we can in a variety of ways. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of research on trust. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of research on emotional contagion. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of research that we can point to. But again, we would be pointing them to a model that maybe they're not used to.
Right.
Although, honestly, it's a model that some of the longer tenured people might long for. I mean, really, I think we're in a position right now where trust is at an all-time low between organizations and employees. Where caring is at an all-time low. And I think the reason for that is we're coming out of 30-some years, and this is a huge rant, but we're coming out of 30-some years of management with the guiding principle of being shareholder value as primary objective. Now, shareholder value is great. Like I got retirement funds. I definitely want shareholder value to grow. But shareholder value is not a goal. It's an effect that happens when you hit a certain cause. And what that cause is creating customers who are delighted. And okay, how do you create that? Well, you create employees who are delighted, right? This is a model that's been around as long as the shareholder value as primary objective model. It's called the service profit chain. The idea that the number one predictor of customer satisfaction is employee satisfaction, is employees' emotions, their level of engagement, all of those sort of things. And so we can point to that and say that yes, all of these things matter for that reason. The problem is if you're having to sell them to people whose primary model, whose primary role of looking at the world is just what ends up at the balance sheet at the end of a month or the end of a quarter so that they can turn that into a real price to shareholders, we have a problem because you can't do this caring thing, this trust thing in the short term. It's a long game. And in the long game, there are stuff that we can point to and have it work. But the reason I said short answer no is that in the short term, it's a really hard sell. If you've got somebody focused on the long term, it's actually a really easy sell.
Yeah. Well, and I quite frankly, I mean, I think it's the only the only value moving forward as more and more things become mechanized. Yes, I just made up a word there. Mechanized.
We've been doing it all day. It's fine.
We've been doing it all day. Yeah. It's fine. But as more things become mechanized and as the robots come to take all of our jobs, and as the algorithms come to take all of our jobs, I think the Alamo, the last stand for humanity at a really broad level, particularly in organizations, and even at a cultural level, is that emotional stuff. The way I say it is, a mother's hug counts. It matters. Sometimes a mother's hug is the difference between a child going off and being, influenced by negative inputs on the street, being influenced by negative peers, and them walking away from that and making a different decision. So a mother's hug matters. These kinds of things that we have never been able to quantify matters, but it's gossamer, right? It's so hard to trace those things back, and thus it's hard to place value on them and really compound them and get more of them. But I think we've got to really try as we move forward, not only into the 21st century, but the 22nd century, and however many centuries are going to come after that one.
I agree. Peter Drucker always said that not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that can be measured matters.
Yep.
And this is, you talk about when the robots come or when the algorithms come. I mean, really, there is a definitive limit on that, which is essentially the things that can be measured. An algorithm can only run things that can be quantified. Now, that said, I think we want to get into a technology rabbit hole. There's a lot of stuff we don't think that can be quantified that can. But it's never going to be everything. It's not going to be absolutely everything. And so there's always going to be a role for that. And the good news, I'm an optimist about this actually, is that humans, I believe, have an intrinsic desire to work, to make a contribution to the people around them, to the society, et cetera, that looks like what we would call work.
Yes.
And so when they're sort of freed up to do that, because the robots and the algorithms are doing all of the monotonous stuff that we used to have to steal their dreams for 40 hours a week and go, no, you need to make that car. Now that they sort of don't have to do that, I think there's going to be this kind of explosion of people doing the work that they're intrinsically motivated to do. When that happens, my hope, and this is the reason for me for writing Under New Management, my hope is that we've figured out how to coordinate and organize those people, because the greatest invention in mankind is the organization, remains the organization. The idea of tapping into 2 or 3 people to get something done instead of relying on each individual to only be working on something. That was the greatest thing we've ever discovered as a society, is how to coordinate labor. And as we shift from that, we need a different rule book. We need a different management guide. And I think, ultimately, this is sort of a good thing. The rules that we have now, I talk about this at the end of the book. The system that we have now, the management that needs new management, is about as effective as the internal combustion engine. If you ever studied physics or thermodynamics, internal combustion engine is only about 30% effective. Only 30% of the energy and gas actually goes into forward motion. And interestingly enough, worldwide engagement rates fluctuate between 18 and 30%, depending on what country you look at or whether or not you look at the whole world. We've capped out at that with this system, right? And the challenge is to build a better system, to build a better engine. There are people out there literally in the work of automobiles, et cetera, who are trying to find more energy efficient, not miles per gallon energy efficient, but meaning the actual energy stored in a fuel efficient in terms of forward motion. And I think the people that I write about, the policies, the practices that I write about in this book and the research that's in this book are experiments in the mental engine. There's a different fuel now. And I think we need a better job of that. And maybe it's because I have kids. I've got 2 boys, or 3 and 1. And maybe I'm an optimist just because I have this realization that 15 years from now, they're going to hit the workplace.
Right.
And I work to make it better when they hit that. I hope that we have figured out how to get that number to at least 50. I would love it to be higher, but at least 50% engagement so that they have a coin flip chance of finding work that is intrinsically meaningful and engaging to them, right? That's my goal now. And I think the only way that we do that is by questioning all of those assumptions and building stuff off of exactly what you talked about. Okay, not everything that matters can be measured, so maybe a system built off the idea that we measure and track everything isn't going to work moving forward.
Right. Yep. Well, that's the last word. I'm going to ask you the final question, which I ask every single one of our guests, but I think we've done a great job of sort of getting to this last question. So what would you like to promote today, if anything?
Well, besides the awesome words that we invented today, I would love to see some of those take off. But really, so under New Management, and we were even recording this before it came out, but Under New Management is the book. And as I said, I have a very selfish parental reason for wanting the ideas in this book to take off. We've got 15 years to really change the world of work before my older son hits the workplace, right? So I would love for people to check out a copy of that book. If you want to find out more about it, or about me, or about the podcast, or anything else, it's davidburkus.com. If you type that in, even if you type it in wrong, it'll probably autocorrect because I've got a very unique name. Mm-hmm. So if you type that into Mr. Google, you will find me. You'll find out more about the book. But I hope you check it out for that reason. Maybe for that grass is greener comparison reason you talked about before, like you just want to know what it's like to work at one of these companies.
Yep.
But hopefully because you either have the power to make some of these changes, or you know the people who need to read a copy of the book and start making those changes in your organizations. So, clock is ticking. We got 15 years.
Great. You know what? And I look forward to seeing where we wind up in 15 years, and look forward to following you on the journey.
We'll circle back here. It'll be like season 18, but we'll circle back right here on Earbud U.
Exactly. And we'll have the links to Under New Management. We'll also have the links to Myths of Creativity, which I'm sure you'll be able to find both of those on Amazon, but we'll have those links along with the link to davidburkus.com and his Radio Free Leader podcast in the player below the doodly doot, as we do every single episode. Once again, thank you, David, for coming on the Earbud U podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.